Welcome everyone to the Kindle Report, where I share my 40 years of experience to help you manage your portfolios and protect your wealth. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share these videos. In yesterday's action, we saw some downside with the NASDAQ leading the way, and I've been discussing over the past several sessions that I expect to see a leadership change. And this appears to be happening right now and is likely to continue. As we watched the markets trade today, we did see the NASDAQ lead the way down. The Dow Jones and the S&P were able to outpace it by not being down as much, but the small cap and the mid caps were down equally the same amount as the NASDAQ. Now, as we go forward, we're likely to see a continuation of this pattern. I don't expect to see any monster downside action here. When I did the video last night and I tagged it that the NASDAQ signals a top, I didn't mean a collapse, just that we've seen a high of prices right now and I expect a high level consolidation. The pattern that's likely to unfold should be a fairly large one, especially after the markets today. We saw Netflix come out with some bad earnings as the stock is trading down around 10% right now. This is going to keep some relative pressure on the markets as we finish up this week. As we're coming into next week is going to be one of the biggest weeks that we've had to look at since the collapse of prices. We're going to see 500 earnings reports come out, which is going to reflect how well the reopened trade is actually happening. Now, there were several companies, including Netflix, that did discuss the forward-looking metrics, but most companies, as I mentioned last night, are not bringing this up at all. They're leaving it open, not making any comments. One of the things I discussed last night that could end up to be bullish didn't really affect the markets, as we saw the claims came in at 1.3, right in line with expectations, and the continuing claims came in at 17.3 million, which is a bit better underneath that 18 million, but it had minimal effect on any of the sentiment as we traded today. In today's reports, we'll see housing starts and building permits. I don't expect them to be material, but everything continues for the most part to come in better than expected. We saw that yesterday as well, primarily with the retail sales coming in at about 7.5% better. The expectation was around 5%. As we come into Friday's close, I'll be watching the NASDAQ very closely as we are likely to experience an outside reversal day. Today's close on the NASDAQ is likely to indicate how the next 2, maybe 3 weeks or more are going to trade. It will definitely be significant on how the markets close today. Overnight, we're seeing some rebound in prices because there was a sell-off as the NASDAQ was down about 102 points. It's now rebounded up about 80, but it's still net 25 to 30 handles lower for the session. Let's go ahead and take a look at the charts, see how this week is likely to finish, and see if we can figure out what the setup will be for coming into next week. As we get started on tonight's technical section, I want to review the WaveTech database, and we continue to see more traction. There's another 326 new buys on 1.2 long, which is our aggressive model, pushing the bullish percent now to 81.02%. Now, this is amazing that we continue to get traction inside of some sloppy days. As I've talked about, it does appear that there's some serious rotation going on in the mid cap and small cap areas. And these are, once again, things to continue to look at over the weekend. I plan on researching and finding some stocks and some sectors that will be best to play as we look at this rotation that's starting. And the rotation I'm talking about is actually new leadership from the NASDAQ leading the way, from the S&P to the mid cap and the small cap indexes. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, this is important for the next level of trend to unfold. Now, just referring back to the opening comments, I discussed that there is 500 earnings reports coming out next week, and these are going to impact market sentiment, positive or negative. It's hard to tell right now, but so far what we've seen, that there are many of the larger companies, they're coming out with much better expected earnings. They're not as bad as expected, but they're actually good and positive on some of the companies. And I'm expecting to see that same trend evolve as we go through next week. Going to the spread graphs, as we go from left to right, we have the Dow Jones, S&P, mid cap, small cap, and I did the futures of the E-mini futures versus the NASDAQ futures. This is reflecting on a futures basis, a slightly different pattern but similar, and this includes overnight trading. We can see this thing evolve as the market's actually trading in real time. If I go over to the hourly chart, the trend that has occurred over the last 5 to 8 days, definitely showing that this inversion in the leadership is occurring. And this is something, talked about this a lot this week, but it is a theme that you need to pay attention to, because this is where the next opportunities are likely to lie. Even if the market were to have a minor correction here, these are still going to be the places you want to watch. And also one of the things to think about, and we saw that today where the markets declined, but the S&P and the Dow Jones didn't decline as much. We did see the mid cap and the small cap indexes then pace with the NASDAQ, but that's not likely to continue. If it does continue and the small and mid caps decline the same as the NASDAQ, that will not be a good sign. I'll be watching this configuration throughout the earnings season over the next several weeks. Looking at the daily NASDAQ futures, yesterday's action, we pushed down below the 10-period moving average, and now we're rebounding back to that level. Before I bring the market grid up for this chart, I want you to observe that the PPMs are starting to lose a lot of momentum. We're still at a plus 0.21 on PPM 1, PPM 2, and 3 are at a plus 0.28. So we're still in a trend mode. And I talked about last night that there's a top being signaled, but does not mean there's a collapse being signaled. What I expect to see is a very large trading range set up here, possibly trading down toward the 10,300 level. And I'll show you that as I bring the market grid up on the chart. As we look at the daily NASDAQ, the overnight action is showing that the S1 is at 10,451. The low so far has been 10,523. I expect to see at least an S1 and the possibility of going down to the S2 level. And this pattern is likely to stay within a R1 S2 range for today, as we're looking right now based on where it's trading to come in about 30, 35 handles lower on the NASDAQ if it stays like this into the U.S. Open. There is a slightly different configuration looking at the NASDAQ futures on a weekly basis. Last week's low was 10,308. This week's low so far has been 10,358. If we trade down below that 308 number, that will confirm an outside reversal on the futures. But this key number today, if the futures close below 10,553 today, that will confirm an outside reversal. That will also confirm a potential for at least 2, possibly 3 weeks on the downside. And the best way to gauge where that downside risk is by going into the monthly chart, looking at the market grid for the monthly, and that would suggest that a low somewhere around S1 at 98.52. As I mentioned, my expectations are that a pattern will set up here, and let me draw that in so you can see what my expectations are. The expectation over the next several weeks would be for a range that would trade within a pattern like this. And meanwhile, we have the 10-period moving average coming up, and this top resistance band, or the top of the market grid, will suggest that somewhere around this 11,100, 200, and on the downside, right now the 10-month moving average is at 7,412, so it's way below it. So we have to go to the weekly numbers to get a sense of where the support is. Going back to the weekly chart, that number is going to be the 10-week moving average, which is rising about 140 points per week. So that's going to put us right at 10,300 roughly. And this is going to be the bottom of the range. We may spike just below that. When we get the new calculation over the weekend for the market grid, this will give us a better feel for where this next bar is likely to lie. But I do expect it to be in this range, 10,300, maybe the 9,800 on the downside, but a trading range. And as I mentioned last night, I believe there's going to be a lot of opportunity to trade in this range. And this is likely to last as we go through the earnings season over the next several weeks. Taking a look at the cash composite, this is clearly an outside reversal on the cash. We've taken out the low substantially, just looking for a confirmation on the futures that I just discussed. The close on the cash will be 10,383 or lower. We close below the S2 number. This will confirm the outside bar and the potential for us to trade down into that range I talked about, maybe down into the 98.80 level, maybe slightly lower early next week. But regardless of that, I don't expect to see a collapse here. These PPMs are way too strong. The 10-week moving average is going to come into play, just like in the futures, right around that 10,200, 300 level. You can see currently over on the grid here that the 10-week moving average is 98.23. And just like with the cash, it's jumping at about 200 points. So that's going to put us at the 10,300 to 10,200 numbers. So these numbers end up to be very much the same. The underlying trends, if you look at the PPMs, PPM1, a plus 1.40, it is declining, and it has cut through its first derivative, and we're likely to see a sidewise trading range set up, a very broad band in the range that I've talked about, 98.23 to as high as 10,600, maybe all the way up to 11,000. So we're going to see lots of gyrations as we go through the next several weeks. I don't believe we're going to collapse here. I do see some downside for the next several days. A lower close below that level will suggest that we'll follow through early on Monday. On Sunday night, I'll cover the key point to look for a reversal as we come into next week's action. Just to keep the theme of what I've been discussing here as far as the leadership change, it's interesting that the NASDAQ is trading toward the low end of the week, and right now the S&P is continuing to trade above last week's high. So this pattern is why I'm looking at a leadership change, and I still expect that we'll see some sideways trading within a range on the S&P. The low end is going to be 3170 level. The high end is going to continue to trade into this 3220, maybe 3240 level. We may take out the highs that we made last week, but the configuration is going to continue to be different. The PPMs are set up slightly different, but I want you to notice that one of the things we've been watching for about 6 or 8 weeks is actually starting to see an acceleration in PPM2. It's still a negative 0.20, but you're seeing it penetrate through its first and second derivative. Both of those lines have been crossed on a price pressure momentum, which is a positive sign. It's telling us that the underlying trend is continuing to unfold, and start to see that the underlying trend suggests there is substantial support under this market, and we're likely to see a consolidation and then further higher moves. So I just want to preface this entire section that I'm doing tonight. I am not predicting a top in a way that there's going to be a collapse, but I am talking about primarily in the NASDAQ that we're going to see a sideways trading, and the S&P may be able to continue to make further grounds and move up toward that number I've been talking about for the last 2 weeks, is the 3280 level. That's still the key level for me. Market grid here. You can see 3249 was R2. We got up to 3238 earlier in the week. The low so far this week has been 3127. It was fairly close to the S2 number at 3120. And on the upside, we had an R2 just short of the R2 number at 3249 with a high of 3248. As we complete this week, a close above 3200 will be a positive sign, and then therefore keeping that leadership change scenario in place as we go through next week. This will complete the video. Have a great weekend. Had a great time on the live stream. Looking forward to next week. We'll talk to you all on Sunday night.